Today's guest is Timothy Gill, Director of Global Studies and Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee. Professor Timothy Gill recently wrote a book called Encountering U.S. Empire in Socialist Venezuela. Tim, we had you on a podcast, I don't know, it was probably like a month ago or 6 weeks ago, something like this. And we ended this podcast talking about how you were at a Hugo Chavez rally speech. I mean, I'm not sure, whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of where we left off. But
yeah,
talking, so like, I mean, how long were you in Venezuela for? I mean, you're at this Chavez rally. What's your experience like at this event and kind of your experience in Venezuela?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would go down there. I went down there for 2 summers, and because that, in between school, graduate, teaching classes. So I went down there for something like 5 or 6 months, and for, to do interviews with people that work for human rights organizations, political groups, some that receive, the U.S. aid funding, U.S. government funding, for human rights or politics or this, that, the other, which, we can get into. But yeah, in the course of that, in 2012, there was an election, Hugo Chavez's last election, actually, before he died the following year in 2013. And it was him against Enrique Capriles, and who's still a prominent guy in the political opposition. And so it was like, oh yeah, we should go to, and my wife had come to, my now wife had come down to visit, and so we went together. And yeah, what I can say, that the Chavez rally was like an all-day party sort of thing. It was in this area, Petare, which is one of the biggest barrios, around the Caracas area. It's a pretty poor, you find the brick housing that goes up the hills and this type of thing. And it was sort of like an all-day long festivity of, people were dancing, drinking, hanging out. And then, finally Chavez came through in a caravan, and people were like, it was like they were overwhelmed with seeing him. They were like, oh my God, it was like seeing, I don't know. It really was kind of surreal too, to see Chavez and to see Capriles, be that close and in these rallies, and you see these people on the screens and these kind of, looming political figures. But you could tell people were like really overcome and emotional seeing Chavez and seeing Capriles, that close. But Chavez, yeah, it was sort of like an all day festivity. And then he came through, at this point, he was, he had cancer, and he was sort of like bloated looking. He was probably on a lot of steroids, I imagine, at that point, and there was other allegations, like people were saying, oh, he's probably snorting cocaine. There's no verification of that, because he would give these speeches that were like 5 hours long, and the dude was like, yeah, he had cancer, he was dying. And it's funny because my they have it, it's somewhere, I got to dig it up on YouTube, but at one point they cut to my wife in the crowd, and you can see her mouth like on the screen, and it was televised, and there was, and they put it up on YouTube, the whole speech or whatever, but you can see her say, Chavez is up there like railing against imperialism. And then I cut to my wife, and she said, oh my God, it's me. You could see her mouth that on the screen. But yeah, the funny thing about at the Chavez, I stuck out very much at the Chavez rallies, and people were like, they would be remarking like, gringo, like, who the, like, why are you here? And I think that, and then at the Capriles, like, we didn't stick out at all. And, and I think that is a testament to the class and also, racial divide in Venezuela. It was, it was colonial, Spanish colonialism, the colonial power came over. There's even, little towns of Germans there, there was, so all this to say that it was, I think sometimes people forget that, like the US, South America was also, however you want to characterize, settler colonized by the Europeans. And there was slavery there as well, like in many parts Brazil and elsewhere in South America. And I think sometimes people forget about that and think in terms of sort of like American exceptionalism, like we had this history that's different than everywhere else, whereas like there's a lot of similar history in many regards in the Western Hemisphere, in terms of, colonialism and slavery and all, and then racial divides. And so, so all that to say is Chavez, at that rally, I stuck out, and people were remarking and looking at me, and that's fine, and where I stayed too, because I was a graduate student, and this would always, I think, kind of surprise some, Venezuelans, because I think they would see me, and I stayed in an area that was like sort of like a poorer area of the city, and would stay in these small like hotel type things. And because I didn't have a lot of money, and they were like, these were like $5 a night as compared to, $80 a night, and a nice, which I wasn't going to afford, 90 days, you know what I mean? It's something like that. And I had some friends around the country I would stay with here and there, but in that neighborhood too, it's people are darker skinned, and you don't see many light skinned people. And so I would stick out. People would often, sort of, they were just, I guess I was an oddity in some ways, and whereas I would go to the other part of town, and where there's a lot of malls and a lot of shopping, more expensive real estate, and no one would look at me twice. I would blend in, and I would blend in at the Capriles rallies. And it was interesting with his too, because he was trying to draw a different vision. He was trying to present himself as this young, healthy guy. So he would be jogging through the streets and jog to the rallies. And one time I remember we went to a mountain town to like get away for the weekend and get out of the loudness of Caracas, the capital city. And then Capriles came running through the mountain town in this big ordeal. So it was everything at that time. And summer of 2012 in Venezuela, like you couldn't get away from political organizing, political life, it was just everywhere. And I mean, it was, as a sociologist and someone interested in politics, it was an amazing experience. It really was, to see, on both sides how inspired they were by these candidates. But I think, the one thing that sticks with me is how much I stuck out in the Chavez rallies, that Chavez rally, and how much I didn't in the two Capriles rallies speeches we went to. But that's because there's a very intense racial divide, like there is, similarly in the U.S. to a certain degree, in East Cleveland, disproportionately Black, East Knoxville, and so that's, and you find that elsewhere too. And I think, I think that sometimes people don't realize that, in other countries, you see that in Latin America too.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I lived in Latin America, various countries in Latin America for several years. But, as you're talking about Brazil, received the largest number of slaves. They had like 5 million. The U.S. was under 400,000. So Brazil had 12 times the number of slaves as the U.S. You don't really hear that. But then also, like after World War I and after World War II, a lot of these, these countries were destroyed in the war. And so a lot of them actually moved to Latin America. Like Venezuela actually took in a lot of these refugees from Europe after the destruction of the war. Like if you read any book on like the Nazis, I mean, they all like, kind of like fled, Argentina. I mean, there's books, if you ever read Bob Baer, I mean, he had a whole series on HBO talking about how Hitler fled to Argentina. But wasn't it like boring, or whoever was like one of the number 2 or number 3 was actually caught by the Israelis in Argentina, and he was shipped back. But it's like that whole era was fascinating. If you've been to like Bariloche, Argentina, you pretty much think you're in Germany. Even to and it's ski resorts, and like it just nothing anyone would expect.
No, it's funny. There's an area that people go to get out of Caracas. It's called Colonia Tovar, and like you go, in Caracas, there's next to no tourism. Like if you look in a tourism book, I remember I was looking in one and they were like, oh yeah, just avoid Caracas, don't go there. Like, because there's other things in Venezuela, like the Angel Falls, the highest waterfall in the world, and like the Roraima. It's like, these huge like plateaus that go into the sky and all this stuff. And, there's the Caribbean coastline, there's, Amazon rainforest, all this type of stuff. Some little islands off the coast. But Caracas is one of the most dangerous cities in the country, or in the world.
In the world, yeah.
In the world, yeah. And so, and it's stressful. It's blaring car horns, a lot of people, it's like New York City, people are very fast paced. They're, they don't like, a lot of people don't want to small talk. They're busy. It's just, that's how it is, whereas, similar, with New York City, but outside the city, like if you go an hour up the mountains, there's this place, Colonia Tovar, and you go up there and it's all blonde haired people that were, German, settlers that came over there and just stayed in this town. And you can get sausage up there, and like they have their own beer, like a dark beer they brew. And it's just really interesting because the people too, like you see them and you're like, yeah, that looks like totally a German blonde haired, but they have the affect of like everyday Venezuelan, like listening to like Venezuelan music and just kind of have, and like the gestures, that Venezuelans point at things with their lips and so it's really, it's just a funny thing. But yeah, I mean, like you were saying, there's a lot of Portuguese people I would run into in Caracas, Italians, who came there. Yeah. And in the, after the war and like you said, in Argentina, and people oftentimes would, think I was, from Argentina, because they would say, where are you from? And I'd say, well, where do you think? And they would say, Argentina, France. But they don't, there's just not much tourism in Caracas, because people, it's dangerous big city. Why are you going to travel around the world to go to a big city,
So your book, again, titled Encountering U.S. Empire and Socialist Venezuela. What's the summary of this book for the people that haven't read it?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is largely about, it's about U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela. And in particular, it's about this process of democracy promotion. And this is sort of turned up in the news in recent months because a lot of the agencies that have been tasked with promoting democracy have been under assault or attack, if you will, however you want to phrase it, from the Trump administration, Elon Musk, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and other institutes, Department of State, and it also has some of these democracy programs. But the two main ones are USAID and National Endowment for Democracy. And so, during the mid 20th century, during the Cold War, it's true, the U.S. supported a lot of dictatorships because they were anti-communist, because that was the main dynamic involving U.S. foreign policy was controlling, containing, stopping the spread of communism and Soviet allies. And so if there was a dictatorship that was anti-communist, the U.S. supported them. Pinochet in Chile, the Somoza family dictatorship in Nicaragua. But something began to happen, and that was that some of these dictatorships were getting overthrown. In Cuba in 1959, the Somozas in 1979. Also had in Iran in 1979. So the thinking in Washington started to change that, oh, wow, some of these dictators could get overthrown. And then now we have a situation where we have a government that is very resentful towards us due to our previous support for the dictatorship and might ally with the Soviet Union and all this type of thing, to oversimplify. So the thinking began to change that, okay, maybe we should not support dictatorships and maybe we should try to encourage democracy. But when we encourage this democracy, we'll help out particular political parties that we like and try to help them get elected, essentially. And so this flew under the name of democracy promotion. If you hear this on the street, you might think, oh, yeah, promoting democracy. That's who wouldn't be against, democracy for the most part. But the reality of the situation is, again, these programs, and that's the funny thing about, as we talked about before with US aid, Musk is out there saying like, he used the word, this is a Marxist agency, and that's like giving away handouts and promoting Marxism. It's like, no, actually, it's quite the opposite, that USAID was being used to undermine governments that were explicitly influenced by Marxism, and Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua. And so it's so fascinating. But anyway, in years past, this type of foreign policy, like, there's not much writing on it. It really flew under the radar, which is also kind of fascinating to me, that it even turned up on Musk and Trump's agenda. It would not have been, it wouldn't have been in the top 50 things I would have thought that they would come after in any regard. But anyway, they did. And so, at the time I was working on this, there wasn't much writing on democracy promotion and what's going on. There's a lot of stuff on warfare, and it's hard to study foreign policy because a lot of it's secretive, unless, they add you to a Signal chat and this type of thing. Years go by and everything gets classified. It doesn't come out. They redact things. They slow things down. Some of the documents I requested from USAID and National Endowment for Democracy took them 7 years to send me. That's how long I had to wait, and years and years. So it's very hard to study this thing. But at the end of the day, I thought it was important because that's how a lot of foreign policy is carried out on an everyday basis by some of these groups. It's not warfare all the time, but it's these smaller programs that are doing the slow game on the ground, trying to influence change. So I knew this was going on in Venezuela, and basically I wanted to look into these programs and see what it is that they're up to and how we can sort of understand these programs. And so I did interviews with people that work at USAID, NED, State Department, worked in various administrations, got the documents, talked to people in Venezuela, some who take money from the US, some who don't, and was just trying to study this whole sort of complex of promoting democracy. And I think that, and this is where the term neocolonialism comes in, and race is in there as well. So democracy promotion, then race and neocolonialism. I think that there still is this, in talking to some of these folks that were promoting democracy in Venezuela, I mean, their approach was very colonial minded, I think. And I think it does harken back to the same colonial mindset of the Spanish, the British, who would come into countries and say, you need to do things our way. They essentially, in a lot of places throughout the world, tried to convert people to certain religion, and not even just that, to certain cultural ways. There's an interesting book I read about Sri Lanka and how when the British came there, there wasn't the idea of monogamy and like single or the family unit, like how we have it today, that people were sleeping with different people in the village and like it was culturally fine. But then when the British came, they started imposing, no, you have to have, you got to get married, you got to have, this, that, the other, just be, sexually active with one person, etc. And so all these things change, of course, language and cuisine and this, that, the other. But in Venezuela, I connect that because when I would talk to some of these administrators that were involved in Venezuela, they presented themselves, it was their duty to go to Venezuela to try to show Venezuelans what their true interests were. And that, they were voting for Chavez and these elections were verified. Jimmy Carter's Carter Center went there, the EU went there. They said, people are voting for Chavez. But in the US perspective, and these folks that worked at USAID, NED, it was that, well, they might have voted for Chavez, but if they really understood what their true interests are, then they wouldn't. And it's our duty to go there to show them and to promote the real democratic actors. And so that's how I connected there with colonialism. And, the race aspect is that, I still think, if you look back at how some folks would talk about individuals in Mexico, they would often rely on tropes about Latino identity, that they are emotional, they're irrational, They're hot-headed. And a lot of the same kind of racial tropes would turn up in interviews, and they would say things about Chavez too, that he was hot-headed, he was irrational, he was a clown. There was always this kind of, even some people I talked to, I would ask them, oh, well, why do you think, Chavez is promoting socialism? Well, I think it's machismo, it's this Latin American, and it's like all of this kind of, racial and ethnic stereotyping to try to make sense of what was going on without ever really trying to make sense of the fact that, like, here was a guy that was elected because, he did prioritize the poor, and many of the poor are darker skinned, and he did do things for them. I mean, there's just no denying that. For the first time in some people's lives, they had access to healthcare, a microwave, security card, subsidized food. And, some people would say, well, he's just handing things out to them. And it's like, well, I mean, people give tax breaks. People give, politics is always a game about providing things to appealing to certain segments in certain sorts of ways. So, yeah, so that's kind of a tangled mess of kind of what I was getting at. And that I don't think that, some people say a lot of foreign policy is just about getting access to the resources, and it's all economic. And that's actually a Marxist, that's a Marxist perspective on this. And so there was this book out there by a guy, and it's a great book. And I tried to build on that and say, it's not just about, because under Chavez, that's the thing, that oil always flowed. It wasn't until Trump put a stop to it. It was always flowing. Citgo oil, Valero, was coming through over to Louisiana, getting refined, And so they always, the Chevron was operating, you name it, they were operating there, And so it was more about a broader vision of how society should operate. And that Chavez was trampling on individual rights, and he wasn't a liberal Democrat, and he was intervening into society too much. And so I think it's more broadly about, the U.S. sees societies, people that work in these agencies, and they have a vision of how society should be run. And economics is part of it, but it's not all of it. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to accomplish in the book, looking at all this type of stuff.
In preparation for this, I read, quite a few books, and it seems like the Venezuela kind of had the first sanctions on them under the second, or I guess you'd say this, second Bush. W, right? I mean, that W is the second. We're talking like back in 2006. Of course, Obama kind of added more sanctions. But I lived in Latin America for quite a few years, and I knew a lot of Venezuelans. And most of the Venezuelans I met hated Chavez, basically said he is an authoritarian dictator, ruined the economy. You go back to 1950s, 1960s, Venezuela was the most prosperous, had the highest GDP of any country in Latin America. It was actually second to the U.S. and all North America, even ahead of Canada for a lot of years. All of a sudden, in the 1980s, they started running these deficits. And so, there's just a lot of people that basically say it's the whole resource curse or the Dutch disease. And then a lot of this money was kind of mismanaged. And I was reading a book called, it was The Motherland, a memoir by Paula Ramon, who is Venezuelan. She basically says that Hugo Chavez was just a dictator, mismanaged his money, and that, people want to talk about sanctions and all this stuff, and it's just kind of a line of shit. And most of the Venezuelans that I've met, and of course, granted, these are the Venezuelans that I've talked to that are not in Venezuela. I've never been to Venezuela. I met them, I spent a lot of my time in Chile, Panama, Costa Rica, etc. And they blame, Hugo for pretty much everything. And these are Venezuelans. I had a business in Chile, and a lot of the Chileans do not like the Venezuelans that are coming there, and the crime, all et cetera, et cetera. But basically, Chile started the Lima Group along with Canada. The Lima Group basically is a coalition of mostly Latin American countries, with the exception of Canada, to try to resolve this issue, because since about 2014, somewhere around 7.5 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. Right, you're talking a population of like 30 million. So you're talking like a quarter, a fifth or a quarter of the population is left, and we're 2025. So you're talking a decade and a year. That's insane. The Peruvians started this Lima group trying to because they want to get rid of the Venezuelans. They want to have them go back to Venezuela because they're putting all this strain on their own system, the culture, their economy. And, every other country, there's 12 countries that signed up for the Lima group, minus, again, Canada. So it's not like it's just, this American thing. Everyone in this Lima group is not American. And so I guess there's just kind of the economics, though, basically the Dutch disease was named after Norway, where they had this natural gas, or excuse me, the Netherlands, after they had this natural gas, deposit that they found in the 1950s. But Venezuela found oil in the 1920s. Like in 1928, the biggest exporter in the world of oil was actually Venezuela. Like Venezuela is the original Dutch disease, right? It seems like there's a lot of I don't know. When I just read stuff, it seems like there's a lot of kind of conflicting things, especially living in Latin America. Like almost everyone I've talked to, because there's so many Venezuelans that have been displaced. Like I've talked to so many Venezuelans about this, and it's interesting to kind of see what you read, what you hear, what the narrative is,
Oh yeah. I mean, Venezuelans didn't migrate really before. In Cleveland, there was I remember there was just a few Venezuelans, and someone put me in touch with someone, and had to call someone oh yeah, I know a few Venezuelans in Cleveland. I was doing some Latin American courses and talking to people, and it was very hard to find someone from Venezuela, because I wanted to talk to, this was very in the beginning of my, doing research. I was just out of undergrad and was just kind of trying to talk to anyone. But now, I mean, you just I was in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then now there are Venezuelan restaurants there, Venezuelan food truck. In Cleveland, there's all these arepa places now. I mean, no one knew what in many regards, no one really knew what an arepa was until the problems, economic problems, and Venezuelans left, and now you have Venezuelans all over. I mean, at least in my sense, in Cleveland, is the arepa. No one would know what that was, but now there's several arepa places, and same thing in Wilmington. And I would talk to people, and they're like, yeah, we left, and Venezuela used to be a place people went to, from Colombia, from we were talking about Portugal, Lebanon, other countries in Latin America. People would go there from all over Latin America, you name it, Mexico, this place, that. And then so now, yeah, it's a very different situation with Venezuelans leaving. They're all over the place, and in Latin America, Western Hemisphere. I remember I met some in Spain as well. I was there for a conference, and I was talking to some Venezuelans. And so now, yeah, Venezuelans are all over. And, some people in Trinidad. And yeah, there's been a lot of issues. People are blaming Venezuelans for, crime issues, blaming in the US, with the gangs and this and that. You see that going on. And so, a lot of blaming, a lot of xenophobia, I think, too. People are, the Venezuelans, there's just kind of a lot of hatred that's directed, and some murders have taken place in some countries. And, yeah, so it really is a sad situation. And it's unfortunate. And I think probably a lot of people probably do want to go home. And that's the thing with Trump, is he wants to sanction the hell out of Venezuela and say you can't sell your oil. And he announced, I think Monday, he said he's going to put a 25% tariff on any country that buys Venezuelan oil. And it's that's the lifeblood for the country. But, and, at the same time, that's what provides the government with dollars, or euros, so that they can import other items, because nobody's going to accept Venezuelan currency. You can print as much as you want, but the exporters aren't going to take that. They want, they want dollars, euros. If they don't have it, then from the oil, then they're not going to be able to import anything. And then you have shortages and this, that, the other. So yeah, I just don't I don't really understand the thought process of Trump. Well, I mean, I do. I think that they want to make things so difficult for the Maduro government that, change happens. They accept change. There's a coup. There's a, this, that. I mean, but they've been trying that for 10 years now. And I mean, even longer, before Maduro with Chavez. And it hasn't worked. So it's sort of, and a lot of people, there's a few books and some economists who are here in the US from Venezuela. And they are always saying like, we know Maduro is awful, but you're only hurting the Venezuelans with all these sanctions. You're just creating the U.S. sanctions didn't create that situation, but they are making it all the more worse. There's definitely there's a very big argument to be made about how Chavez managed the economy and then of course how Maduro is managing it. Chavez, when he was in power, the oil price was high. It was over $100. And so he could afford to put all this money in these social projects, and subsidized food and, literacy campaigns, healthcare. A lot of that was a cooperation with Cuba. And then the price of oil went down. Wasn't as much money. There were other issues going on, currency manipulation, and a lot of corruption as well. There's been numerous cases. And I think after Chavez died, Maduro came to power, the oil prices were down, corruption. Then, the thinking is Chavez was able to control some of the corruption and he was able to control things behind the scenes and keep, people happy and people respected him. But then when Maduro came to power, it was sort of like a free for all that people, I think, just started, trying to get just massive corruption, that people were trying to get anything they can. And then, putting a lot of the money into Miami, and a lot of people got caught. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot to be said about the Dutch disease, the resource curse. I mean, Norway is very reliant on energy, but that's what a lot of people would say. Venezuela could have did things that like other countries like Norway and elsewhere did, such as like creating a sovereign wealth fund, creating funds, putting money away, and then the massive corruption, I guess, trying to do something about that. But that's the thing. A lot of people will say, well, Venezuela shows that socialism doesn't work. Meanwhile, probably everything in their house comes from China, and that's a separate issue. But I don't think that the issue was socialism. Like you were saying, a lot of it had to do with the over reliance on oil. They never really diversified. Whereas other countries, I wrote an article several years ago with a colleague, and she is from, I believe, if I recall correctly, from Trinidad. And we were writing about the differences between Venezuela and Trinidad, and how, and her argument was that they were able to diversify their, petrochemical industry and have more like downstream products. Whereas Venezuela just, was so hyper reliant on the oil that it never really, did. I mean, before the oil, I think one of like their main, exports was like chocolate, and there never was much, for whatever reason, I don't know why or how this all worked, but yeah, they just never diversified away. And so then when the prices collapsed, then, so too did the country. And so, yeah, I mean, I think people will say, well, Venezuela or socialism doesn't work. I mean, it was working just fine when there was money, when the money was coming in many respects, because they were able to pay for all these things. But, and yeah, a lot of people a lot of people left too under Chavez because he was, expropriating, taking control over certain sectors of the economy, oil, other things too, glass factories, mines, things of this nature. And some people with money probably stood to lose, And so, there has been a longstanding anti-Chavez community in Florida. But yeah, obviously, as you said, as the situation got worse, more people have left, a staggering number. And so, I mean, it's a story I think people will be dissecting, writing dissertations, research on for a long time.
You can't read a book on Venezuela without understanding oil, because essentially Venezuela is a petrostate, And like, I actually found it interesting that the whole precipitous of OPEC was actually by like the director of like the hydrocarbons minister in Venezuela, who went over to the Middle East, because at this point Venezuela was actually the most developed country. People think now of like Saudi Arabia and Iraq or whatever, but like at the time it was actually Venezuela. And of course even now, like, Venezuela has the most known oil deposits, at least of crude oil, not like say like fracking like in the US, but with
Right.
crude oil is just pure crude oil is a lot easier, because you just like throw up a derrick and just like pump it out versus having to have this specialized equipment. But like Venezuela was like at the heart. They were the primary driver of the whole OPEC, and then they really benefited from the embargoes in the 1970s, and they were just flush with all this cash. But they, like, at least again, the stuff that I've read, they just never managed the money well. And then instead of actually diversifying, they just instead of, like you mentioned, they never started like their a sovereign wealth fund. Apparently, from some of the books I read, they actually did start a sovereign wealth fund, and then they actually ended up blowing $300 billion, like on it. So it actually kind of backfired on them. And we've seen other countries. I mean, like, isn't the president of Malaysia, right, or whoever? I think it's the prime minister of Malaysia. Isn't he in jail because he blew through like over $1 billion in the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia as well? Like, it's a fairly, President Trump was talking about starting a podcast. Yeah, I had a podcast on this a while back, but he's talking about starting a sovereign wealth fund, and it's like, yeah, okay, like, so who's gonna abuse that? Like, I mean, you got to have a pretty good, political system in place to actually not abuse that. You want to talk about socialism? Have a $5 trillion in the U.S. and start buying Google, and then you got voting shares. Like, talk to Google. Hey, I don't like you doing this. I don't like you talking about this politician or this politician. And you have voting shares because you like own like 80% of the company. You can do whatever you want.
No, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, yeah, I think that's like you said. I think that's a big part of the story, that a lot of the money was mismanaged and a lot of it was siphoned off in corruption. And people were trying to get as much as they can, and that's just just a terrible mix. And there was a lot of it was the currency distortions were, what was happening was the government, in Venezuela. I mean, it's a wild situation with the currency. When I was going there in around 2012-ish, the official rate for the dollar was like 4 bolivars, but the real rate, like if you went to the bank or whatever, or the government office, they would give you $1, 4 bolivars. But the real rate was like $1 equals like 7.5, 8 bolivars. And so, like, you never exchange your money in Venezuela at the official rate. You exchange it at a hotel or a restaurant, or someone who just wants dollars. And it's pretty blatant. I mean, remember in Caracas, some people would have dollars on the street and be openly, doing these transactions or promoting these transactions. But yeah, no, what I would do is I would often go to, it was annoying because you'd have to bring cash with you and then like exchange like $100 here and $100 there. And, but I don't know what the rate is now, but it was getting crazy. Whereas like the official rate was like $1 equals 4 bolivars. The real rate was like $1 equals like 1,000 bolivars. It was getting like absurdly out of control. But people were able to game that system by, if they because what you could do is you could go. They also you could apply to get dollars from the government too. And they would use that official rate as well. So if the government okayed you to get dollars, then you could go in and go 4 bolivars, $1. But then you could go out, get that dollar and get, exchange that for 1,000 bolivars. And it was just creating like massive issues because people would say, a lot of businesses would be prioritized and they would say, well, we're importing, diapers, or we're importing, whatever the hell it is. And they would say, we need $10,000. And so then they give them 40,000 bolivars and then they get $10,000, and then they, and they wouldn't import anything. And, there was just crazy things like this that were going on that were creating shortages, and people would just take the money and park it elsewhere, and then people were bringing, like, you could buy gas was so cheap in Venezuela, it was like a penny a gallon or something outrageous. So people were, there's a big smuggling thing in Colombia and Venezuela. So people were like filling up, like semis or whatever they are, just chock full. Like it would cost them, like, I don't know, let's say like $500, and they could take it over the border and sell it for like 30,000. Crazy situations like this that were not helpful to the Venezuelan economy and this kind of currency mess. So yeah.
Well, I said that was the reason there are shortages, right? Because you'd have these, like, okay, you got to have the corn flour for the arepas, but then the Venezuelans couldn't buy the arepas because it was price controlled. So everyone would buy it up, then they would just go over to Colombia or Brazil, which are, you go to, the two closest areas, and then they would sell it at triple the price. Same thing with like people were like, oh yeah, but Venezuelans were like going over with 2 gallons of gas. No, it was actually government officials that were sending entire truckloads of petroleum to Colombia, and then they that's how like the food shortages, because you artificially keep it low. Then if you can go across the border and 3, 4, 5x your profit, of course people are going to do that, right? It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, I know. When I was hearing about it, I'm like, God, I want to fly down there and fill up with gas and bring it over to Colombia. It's like, gosh, that's a easy 30 grand or something. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, the incentives are just, the incentive for corruption just became incredible.
On Wall Street, arbitrage, right? Where you're making like 2-3 cents on arbitrage. Here you're making 3x, right? Like, okay, we're gonna you have these complex financial instruments that they're doing. You just get like a government official to send over a truck of the petrol at 1 penny versus selling it for $7 a gallon, whatever. I mean, that's insanity,
Yeah, and it was just I mean, the incentives for corruption and for that were just absolutely through the roof. Plus, with government officials like, things are going to hell anyways, might as well get what I can now and try to get out of here before we all go to jail, and I think that's one of the things too that they're trying to work on with Maduro, or they're always talking about. They're trying to, I think what they want to do, or what they were trying to do for a long time, was try to convince them to go to like Cuba or something like this, but then, Trump had this, I don't know if you remember, they had like this poster, like wanted poster for Maduro, and it was like $5 million for his capture. So it's like, if you're doing that, then there's no incentive to leave power. There's not gonna, if you're saying we're gonna catch you and we're gonna bring you, then like the only safety for him is to stay there, And so that's why I just don't understand sometimes these mixed signals. Cause like over the weekend, Maduro, initially said wasn't going to accept any planes of, people being deported from the US, and that's a big, administrative issue that they're trying to say, oh, we're deporting all these people. And so Maduro said, oh, we came to an agreement on Saturday and I'm accepting a plane. But then on Monday, Trump turned around and said, oh yeah, now we're imposing 25% tariffs. And it's like, what is the strategy here? And right after Trump came to power, he had an envoy go over there, Richard Grenell, and talk and negotiate, took pictures with Maduro. And there was and he went in the news and said, no, we're not trying to engage in regime change. And then Trump turned around and ended protected status for Venezuelans and said, oh, now you guys got to go. And that pissed off a lot of Venezuelans who have family members, that are here and not a citizen. And so now, you have many in the Venezuelan community that are pissed off at Trump. And it's very hard to, I mean, I know Marco Rubio would love to get rid of, get rid of Maduro. How much say he has, I don't, it's tough to, it's hard to say precisely what's going on, what the what the plan is, I guess, at this point.
The ultimate question is, I mean, what are we going to see with Venezuela in, say, like the next, I don't know, decade? We mentioned the Lima group, which is really spearheaded by, Peru, which of course is why it's called the Lima group, right? Where they, Peru's getting a lot of these Venezuelan immigrants. But basically the bottom line is that, at least from what I've read, is that of course, in 1976, Venezuela decided to nationalize the petroleum industry. So the petroleum sector then became a state sector of Venezuela. And then in the 90s, they decided to renegotiate those contracts with a lot of the multinational corporations. Some of the multinational corporations didn't like the terms of that. So then Venezuela basically said, fuck you. We're just going to take over your company. I believe Chevron was one of them where they didn't agree to the terms. So basically they were getting 90% of the profits, and they didn't even build any of the infrastructure. This is all built by these national corporations. So, and then of course, at this point, you kind of pissed off a big subset of the petroleum industry, which has a few people that actually have the expertise to do this. Then in 1998, Chavez was elected president. In 2002, they had a coup where Chavez is not president for a few days, which was led by a lot of the people from the state-sponsored petroleum company. And then Chavez was on TV firing people on TV, fired 19,000 of these people from this petroleum company. Many of them were irreplaceable because he then replaced them with cronies, people that had zero expertise, that were just loyal to Chavez. And then, of course, now the entire petroleum company, you have little expertise. They didn't do any, they didn't maintain any of the infrastructure. Venezuela is known to have many electrical outages, again, because they got rid of a lot of, if you questioned anything, you were basically canned. You had to be loyal to the regime. And so now all the expertise is gone. You have a bunch of political pundits running these highly specialized departments, whether it be in energy, whether it be in the oil sector. And then, where you're talking about how, the USAID or, NED is funding these programs to have opposition. Well, then you also nationalized a lot of the media. So, or the media is just a bunch of political elites. Because when you have, cronyism, essentially you just have people that are taking money. So you have a bunch of people, even if they're private companies, if they're receiving money from government contracts, they're going to be, pretty biased. So, I mean, is it just fair to say, like, hey, maybe they had no opposition because all the regular media was just kind of hijacked? And I think in the US, you could probably say a lot of the same thing. Isn't the US media controlled by like 6 people or 6 companies, whatever, I think that, but basically if it's controlled by a handful of people, maybe it's not a bad thing to actually have, some opposition. I'm not saying that you have to agree with that opposition, but at least maybe it's not bad to have an alternative viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it was a process, I think. It wasn't you had a lot of opposition kind of media, they were taking part in the coup in 2002. RCTV, was basically promoting the coup. So it wasn't, it was sort of gradual over time that some of these some of the media outlets and periodicals, would get bought out by someone that was friendly with Chavez or what have you, and a lot of it was, with RCTV, they didn't renew their license, and they said, well, they participated in this coup against me. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to, so there was always an argument that was out there that like, well, they participated in the coup, so, we're not going to renew their license. So they can't be on, regularly accessed. They still existed. They just weren't on like basic television sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this did happen over time, and the government, and now is certainly more authoritarian under Maduro. I mean, there was a lot of space, under Chavez. I mean, rallies were covered on television. There was supposed to be, a certain number of certain kind of like quota of time that you could be on television. And they would say, Chavez would abuse this. He would be on, he would be on TV more than he was supposed to be on regular TV. But it wasn't as if, Chavez lost an election and he conceded. There was a constitutional referendum, I think, somewhere around like 2007, 2009-ish. And he lost that election, and and he conceded, yeah, I lost this election. I thought, we were going to win. Opposition existed in the Congress. Chavez didn't always have a majority in the Congress. But, some people would argue that Chavez, again, would do things to alter the playing field. Like, there was always allegations, and probably true, that he was using state funds for his campaign purposes, things like this. And again, abusing time on television, like you said, firing people, hiring loyalists in the government. But I don't, at the end of the day, people voted for him, and they did want him. It really wasn't until Maduro that we've seen, pretty clear evidence of manipulation of the votes, in the last election, in election before, and altering the playing field too, like, I can't remember all the details, but there can be a recall. You can recall the president if you want to. And this happened to Chavez. They recalled him. He said, okay, we'll do another election. And he won that election, but you have to get a certain number of voters to sign. Like, I think it's like 1% or something like this. And then they were going to do this to Maduro, and Maduro said, no, it's not 1% broadly. You have to get 1% in every state in Venezuela. So just like doing these things to really alter the playing field. He was doing things with the National Assembly. It's not, you're only going to find a lot of people that will who were at the time defending Chavez. If you go back and look, a lot of people a lot of like leftist outlets, let's say, in the US were like defended Chavez, didn't like US intervention, didn't like what the US was doing. And I don't think, I don't agree with how, funding political parties abroad. I think, if human rights, like if it's a human rights group and they're doing legitimate things, and some groups that the US was funding were doing, legitimate monitoring attacks on journalists, get out the vote drives, things of this nature. But, we wouldn't allow funding for political parties here, and so it's kind of hypocritical to do that and try to alter the playing field as well. And this became a source of justification too all the time for Chavez and Maduro. Well, the U.S. they're financing these groups, they're financing, this, they're doing that. We need to stop imperialism, so that was always, and it often resonated with Venezuelans too. The American empire and the nationalism, that we have to strengthen Venezuela, that nationalist resonates here and it resonates there too. But it really, under Chavez, I wouldn't characterize it as a dictatorship and any sort of, not really close to a dictatorship. Under Maduro, it does approach that vicinity. There's still an opposition. There's still opposition, governors, people in various positions. But Maduro has clearly, shown that he's willing to rig the vote so that he stays in power. So, it was, there was a very vocal and apparent opposition to Chavez in the media and in newspapers. But over time, things were getting closed down, bought out, and space has closed. I think that is definitely true. That they were creating parallel universities, depriving universities of funding. All these, and like you said, with the loyalists in government and in all this type of thing, people feeling like they couldn't criticize or speak out, had to toe the line of the government, that they had to go to Chavez rallies. That was always, the allegation, and seems pretty obvious from some evidence that they were very strongly encouraged that, they had to be at the rallies for, Maduro, Chavez, all this type of thing.
So where does Venezuela go from here? The fact is, as I mentioned, this Lima group, where a lot of these other Central American countries, I mean, they don't want the Venezuelans mainly because their economy can't kind of absorb it, and so they're actually, like I said, Chile has had for years a fairly strong economy. That's why them and Peru are kind of like spearheading this. I mean, Canada, obviously. I mean, I'm not sure what Canada had to do with it. They were also part of it, but they have different interests. But I mean, the fact is, if you're talking about like, I mean, I Googled today, I was saying 7.7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2014. And you're talking a population of less than 30 million. I mean, just do the math on that. I mean, that's an insane, that's over 25% of the country. Can you imagine if 25% of Americans left, you'd be looking at like 80 million, 75 million people. You'd be flooding these countries. And not to mention, a lot of these Latin American countries, they're not that populated. I mean, think, Chile, Colombia, Brazil. I guess Brazil's fairly, Brazil's populated, don't get me wrong, but Colombia, going up to Chile, going up to Argentina, they're not that populated. When you're introducing millions of Venezuelans or millions of people, there is a massive impact. How does this issue get resolved? To me, it seems like they have to get the oil company fixed, because if you're not producing oil, you're not producing revenue. How do they actually solve this? I mean, everyone wants it solved, right? The Venezuelans want it solved because they, of course, want to go home, and other countries want it solved so they have oil and they have, just a place where people can, everyone wants to go home anyways, right? We all know that, right? Home is where your heart is,
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, it's like no one wants to leave their home, and I mean, it's my wife, and I know you've traveled around and whatnot. My wife's from Albania, and she loves her hometown. I love her hometown. It looks like a fairy tale. It's on a little lake in Albania on the border of Macedonia. I mean, it literally looks like a fairy tale. But yeah, there's the economic. When they left, there was a lot of corruption after collapse of communism, and a similar situation. Like if the Democratic Party was in power and you were a Democrat, then you could get a job. If the other party, Labor Party, whatever was in power, okay, then the loyalists got the job. And it was just, not much opportunity. And when they had the opportunity to leave, then they did, it just causes a lot of, and there's no other place than your home. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people are saying that they gotta try to bring Maduro to the negotiating table. I mean, that's kind of not a very satisfying answer, but I think, I don't know how putting these extra 25% tariffs now, and Trump said he'll tariff any country if they buy, and now, so that's causing some countries like China and India to think about, what they're going to do. And if they're not buying the oil, then there's, nothing's coming into Venezuela. So, of course, I think Trump's strategy is to make things so horrible in Venezuela that somehow this will Maduro will leave, or he will, the military will overthrow him. But that hasn't happened. And that's the sad thing. It's like, okay, so these sanctions, there's like, they have totally contributed to the exodus of Venezuelans from the country. And so, I mean, I don't know. I don't have a very satisfying answer. I think that a lot of countries would like to see Maduro a negotiated exit for Maduro. But so far, I'm sure this has probably been talked about. I know they were talking about, well, we allowing him to go to Cuba, for instance. There was talk of that, like, okay, why don't we provide Maduro safe passage to Cuba, and we won't prosecute him, and we'll try to, because there's a lot of concern too among, like, not just Maduro, but other people who have been sanctioned by the U.S. Diosdado Cabello, other people involved in that Maduro world, that, like, okay, what's going to happen when we're not in power? Are we going to face all this mass prosecutions? Are we going to be, and so some people are like, they see their, like, everything tied up with remaining in power, and so I think, there's that fear among people in the government. strange as it is to talk about, the fear of, them. But yeah, I don't know. Things things still look really bleak. It's hard to, but I hope, Venezuelans can, things can get better and Venezuelans can decide their own future, in elections. Because sometimes, yeah, people would say, oh, because my work would be critical of the U.S. and, oh, you're just, promoting Chavez and Maduro. And it's like, no, I don't, I want people to decide their own, decide their own leaders. I'm not telling anyone who to vote for, this, that, the other. I just, my book is spotlighting how U.S. tax dollars are used to interfere in politics in Venezuela and how that all works out. And, and that's, if people think that's fine, okay. I don't think some aspects, like I said, I don't think, it's not funding political parties, but it's like funding to help them strategize, and, setting up workshops, helping them build websites, enhancing all their capabilities, bringing people down from the party, from the Republican Party, from the Democrat Party to strategize with them, to do all these things. And, I don't really agree with that. But, I'm just one citizen. So but it's fascinating. Like I said, seeing these organizations get the axe. Although, I don't think that U.S. intervention in Cuba and Venezuela is going to stop. I mean, Rubio said they canceled like however many contracts, like 80%. I wouldn't be surprised if in that 20% is, this type of stuff going on in Venezuela and Cuba. I think there's zero chance that, there's that intervention in those countries is going to end in some form or fashion.
The last time, Tim, we had John, we were talking about USAID as well as NED. And I saw that you wrote an article. This is like a couple weeks ago, kind of talking about USAID and NED, talking about how it essentially started, with JFK in 1961. And then this is, of course, when the Cold War was going on. After the Cold War ended, yeah, people wanted to kind of disperse the blob, as that whole subset of these kind of like, I guess you could say, like defense contractors and the politics involved in this are called. And then so in order to kind of circumvent that, they created NED in 1983 under Reagan. And then so basically NED was kind of carrying out a lot of the activities that the CIA was doing. And I mean, kind of what's just like right now where it's like, I mean, if you were in like a U.S. citizen in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, like most of the stuff you just never would have heard of. Like you wouldn't even know what was going on in Venezuela or the Middle East. And now with the internet, with social media, and I think one of the reasons that a lot of the, quote unquote elites or governments don't like social media is because you could have one person with a cell phone in Venezuela or wherever filming something. I mean, how do you deny that? Like, oh, that didn't happen. That person, doctored that, or whatever. Like, so you kind of like, everyone has kind of access to things that we would never would have had access to before, because you would have had to have the mainstream media, which, in certain countries would have been funded by the government or funded by the elites. And so now we have this, this, democratization of all these, the media sources. And now like everyone's talking about like, oh, like, we have all this polarization, blah, blah, blah. I think, yeah, there's polarization of politics online. If you just like live life, I don't think anyone is polarized. I think it's just on like the people that are, polarized probably don't have a real job and they just are online all day thinking like, oh, like these people believe that. Like, have you actually talked to one of these people? Oh no, you haven't, because you haven't left your fucking $6 million mansion. So like, what do you know? Like, why should I listen to you? But I mean, that's kind of like, but I guess, the question is just like, I mean, how is this stuff going to unfold? I mean, obviously social media is not going away. I mean, we need, Venezuela. I mean, I think you're right. I think the reason that Trump was putting these sanctions on was he's trying to basically like, he wanted to create an end to Venezuela so they could restart, rebuild. But like, you either got to go in there and like, you either got to crush it or you have to stabilize it. There can't be any in between. And if you don't do any in between, you're just going to drag it out, which doesn't benefit anybody.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know. Yeah, I mean, there was talk about, for a time, Trump was trying to float the idea of invading Venezuela, and but I think cooler heads prevailed and convinced him it wasn't a very good idea. There's that it wouldn't be a good idea to go in there and try that sort of thing. I mean, you got a lot of people that are tied up with Venezuela too, Russia, China, and to say nothing of loss of life and all that type of thing.
Think Cuba.
Right, exactly. And so, yeah, you just don't know how something like that could spiral. And of course, the lesson of Iraq and what have you. But yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, it's kind of a bleak picture, I think, right now, because when you start dialing up all these, somebody with nothing left to lose is a dangerous person, as they say. And when you're just making it worse and worse and worse for Venezuela, I don't, that hasn't worked. Sanctions often don't work. They are, for domestic purposes, they can say, hey, look what we're doing to this country, but effectually they don't. Sanctions didn't work in Iraq, Iran, they haven't worked in Venezuela. I mean, I think it's just it's often seemingly for domestic purposes, or I guess maybe they're sadists that do want to make it that bad and maybe delight in that. But I mean, from policy, it seems it's more for domestic purposes than actually achieving anything. And so, yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are trying to have been critical, who don't like Maduro, but are critical of the sanctions because they make the situation so much worse in so many regards. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, nothing surprises me anymore, but I just feel like this, I don't, I feel like Maduro is going to be there. He'll be there I think he'll be there for some more years. And I don't know how, when or why he would leave. But it's a bleak situation. Yeah, you can, now you have to get a visa to go to Venezuela. I haven't been back in a number of years, and you have to go to an embassy and apply, and so it's difficult to even get there. So yeah.
I mean, kind of just a larger, I guess, geopolitical question would be like, since basically like late 2020 or early 2021, the U.S. has been a net exporter of both petroleum and crude oil. And so, I mean, obviously, if you're like Venezuela, I mean, in your main export is crude, but then you have like the U.S. not necessarily needing this because we're now our next exporter. And I understand, like, we have a lot of refining capabilities and capacity, so we could still import that crude, exported as petroleum and other products. But the bottom line is, like, the U.S. is basically receiving very little imports because of all the fracking and things like that. We're basically importing crude at the levels we did in the 1970s when we had like 100 million less Americans. And I would imagine like every, kind of year going forward, the U.S. will be importing less and less crude. And we're just going to be this massive net exporter of both crude and petroleum. To me, if there's no market for their exports, I mean, the only market they really have right now is Cuba, Russia, and China. And when you say sanctions, I mean, like, you also have to kind of explain that. I think a lot of, you use the word sanctions, a lot of people don't know what that means. But basically, like, they don't have access to, kind of Western markets, right? So the only access they really have would be, they would have to align with Russia, China, or the, quote unquote BRICS, whatever, right? They're basically not part of that SWIFT protocol. And so then you end up like, okay, well, because a lot of the books I would read would be like, well, yeah, but you have China and Russia, it basically are propping up Maduro because they want to get access to that oil. I mean, China apparently doesn't even take, Venezuela has a lot of debts to China. They don't even take money. They just take oil. Like they care about they take it, okay, I just pay it, and so, but then at the same time, well, why do they have shortages of oil in Venezuela? Well, because like they have to pay their debts off to China and Russia and crude, and then they shipped in all these doctors from Cuba to Venezuela, under Chavez in the 90s and early 2000s. So then they also have to give them also a certain amount of oil to pay for those doctors. And so it's a roundabout way of basically saying, like, I don't know how Venezuela gets back on track if, like, for years the biggest country that needed this oil from Venezuela was the U.S., but now U.S. is a net exporter, and in the future it doesn't look like anything's going to change. And the only country they can actually ship their product to is Russia and China.
Yeah.
And Cuba.
Yeah. Right. I know. Yeah. No, it's I don't know. It's a tricky situation. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there were some domestic stakeholders in the U.S. who were angry that the Venezuelan oil stopped, because the Citgo market, I mean, I think they would probably still find something of a market to send. But yeah, I think the real problem now is how the U.S. is basically, trying to tell other countries, not to buy anything from Venezuela, and basically to isolate the country. But that is a interesting situation involving the U.S. and elsewhere. I mean, apparently they're always describing, China as very, oil hungry, and are consuming more. So, and they did, Venezuela was trying to diversify. One thing it did do is diversify away from the U.S. even before, the U.S. prohibited oil sales to the country. So they did do a good job of, diversifying away, getting things to China, getting things to Russia. But like you said, they're in a lot of debt to China, and Chinese government was allegedly, very unhappy with how everything was getting mismanaged, and not very thrilled with them.
Today's guest has been Professor Timothy Gill, who is the Director of Global Studies and Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, where he discussed his book, Encountering U.S. Empire in Socialist Venezuela. Tim, let us know where people can find you, that kind of information, and just leave us with a final thought related to this podcast.
Yeah, you can find me. I'm pretty active on social media, Twitter and Blue Sky. I think my handle is Tim Gill 924. Don't really have an official website. I need to build one, but I really appreciate you having me on. And it's a messy situation involving Venezuela, and I hope there's some sort of resolution and people can return and things get better, for Venezuelans. But it's kind of a bleak picture right now.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.